The Consumer Guide to Agency. Every brokerage in Ohio is required to have a consumer guide to agency. It can be a brochure, it can be a flyer, it can be some form of document, but it must contain the brokerage policy on representing buyers and sellers, a discussion of if and when dual agency may occur, how the brokerage will cooperate with co-brokes, and have a place where the prospective buyer or seller can sign that's an acknowledgement that they received a copy of the policy. When must a consumer guide be used? Well, the sale or lease of vacant land regardless of zoning, the sale of a parcel of real estate that's 1 to 4 residential units in it. So even if it's a commercial, like a corner bar that has an apartment upstairs, you'll need a consumer guide to agency. And the leasing of residential properties if the rental agreement is for a term of more than 18 months. The consumer guide is not required in commercial and industrial deals. So what are the triggering events for sellers? You must have the consumer guide signed by the seller before marketing the property, before showing the property. So it's a good idea to have it signed during the listing appointment. Now for buyers, it's a bit trickier. Before you initiate pre-qualification evaluation of your prospective buyer to determine if they're financially qualified to purchase a house. Before you ask them for specific financial information, such as, have you sat down with a lender to get pre-qualified? Or, do you have a pre-qualification letter? Before showing any property, except at open houses, that's an exception. You don't have to have everybody coming through your open house sign a consumer guide. However, look at the next triggering event before discussing making an offer. So you're at your open house, you're hosting an open house, and one of the prospective buyers who's attending comes to you and says, hey, do you think the seller would accept an offer of? Well, you know what? If you answer that question, you're discussing making an offer. So you should have copies of the consumer guide available in case you do get into one of those discussions. And finally, your buyer clients need to sign before submitting an offer on their behalf. Now we know that the first triggering event occurs often by telephone or electronic mail, email, an internet lead, or they call in. Your responsibility in that case is to discuss the nature of the agency relationship you have with the buyer and seller. Thanks for calling on 123 Main Street. I'm the listing agent. That means I represent the seller. And in this case, if you'd like me to show the property or work with you, you would be a customer. So you have to discuss the nature of it. And you must provide the consumer guide to the buyer at the first meeting. So that's how you handle triggering events. So let's look at our consumer guide to agency relationships. The first paragraph is introductory. We tell them that we're pleased they've selected Keller Williams Greater Cleveland Southeast to help with their real estate needs. Whether selling, buying, or leasing real estate, Keller Williams Greater Cleveland Southeast can provide you with expertise and assistance. Because this may be the largest financial transaction in which you participate, it's important to understand the role of the agents and brokers with whom you are working. And then we tell them that here's some information that might be useful. The next 4 paragraphs do not apply to our brokerage, but globally represent the types of agency permitted in the state of Ohio. So it's important to let them know because we may not practice every agency related. So it talks about how Ohio allows agents to represent sellers. It talks about signing a listing agreement to represent their interest. It talks about representing buyers, what the state asks us to do. The next paragraph talks about dual agency, which is allowed in Ohio licensing law, but not by our brokerage policy. And finally, representing both buyer and seller in a brokerage, and we do practice this. The key paragraph to go over with your potential clients is the one starting with working with Keller Williams Greater Cleveland Southeast. It explains our agency policy. So we offer representation to both buyers and sellers. Therefore, the potential exists for one agent to represent a buyer who wishes to purchase a property listed with another agent in our company. If this occurs, each agent will fully represent their own client, but the brokerage and its management level licensees act as dual agents. So when this happens, the brokerage and management level licensees maintain a neutral position, and we won't take any actions that favor one side over the other. However, we will supervise both agents to assure that their clients are fully represented. Goes on to state that while it's a policy of Keller Williams Greater Cleveland Southeast to allow a buyer and seller in the same transaction to be represented by two agents in our brokerage, it does not permit one agent to represent both parties. And by our policy, this includes our teams. So if you are a buyer's agent for a team in which the listing is held by the rainmaker, then you as a buyer's agent actually will continue to represent the seller. So therefore, a listing agent working directly with a buyer will represent only the seller's interest. The agent will still be able to provide the buyer with non-confidential information, prepare and present offers at their direction, and assist the buyer in the financing and closing process. However, the buyer will represent their own interest. Because the listing agent has a duty of full disclosure to the seller or buyer in this situation, should not share information with the listing agent they don't want the seller to know. If a buyer wishes to be represented, we'll appoint another agent in our brokerage to act as their agent, or they can seek representation from another brokerage. By the way, if you are selling your own listing, we require that you use our unrepresented buyer agreement. We also outlined how we will work with other brokerages. So it tells us that does offer representation, both buyer and seller, when Keller Williams Greater Cleveland Southeast lists property for sale. It also cooperates with, and we offer compensation to other brokerages that represent buyers. We do reserve the right in some instances to vary compensation it offers other brokerages. As a seller, you should understand that just because Keller Williams Greater Cleveland Southeast shares a fee with a brokerage representing the buyer, it does not mean that you will be represented by the buyer's brokerage. Instead, that company looks out for their buyer while we represent the seller's interest. Now, when acting as a buyer's agent, we may also accept compensation offered by the listing broker. And if the property is not listed with any broker, we will attempt, or the listing broker doesn't offer compensation, we do attempt to negotiate for a seller-paid fee. We include a fair housing statement, and then we tell them that we hope this information is helpful. When they're ready to enter into transaction, they'll be given an agency disclosure statement that specifically identify the roles of agents and brokerages. We invite them to ask us questions. Reviewing the consumer guide is a great time to discuss agency and get a commitment for your representation of the potential client. The information in bold is required by the division. Because it is important that you have this information, Ohio law requires that we ask you to sign below, acknowledging receipt of this consumer guide. Your signature will not obligate you to work with our company if you do not choose to do so. And Ohio law requires that we tell them how they can contact the Division of Real Estate and Professional Licensing. So they will sign, make sure they receive a copy, and you retain a copy for your files.